the economic history of art and culture, as we shall see here. Now, there are a whole number of false beliefs around about the relationship between economics and economists on the one hand, and capitalism as well, and on the other side, art and culture. So the general view is the one you've got in the first line here, that art and the market economy, capitalism, or even the whole economic way of thinking are antithetical. In other words, there's a kind of inherent clash or disagreement between the artist on the one hand, the economist on the other. And this is often summed up in this quote from Oscar Wilde, very well-known one. An economist is someone who knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. This is actually wrong anyway, as any economist can tell you, but also it's wrong in terms of its application to art. The implication of what Oscar Wilde was saying when he said this is that there's a tension between the logic and demands of artistic creativity and those of a market. In other words, the artist is someone who is always going to be out of sorts in a market economy or a society driven by the logic of the market. The two are always going to be in conflict. The artist is always going to be a rebel, if you like, an opponent of the market system. Historically, this is totally false. So what is the actual picture? First of all, art is actually a product or consumption good, like many others. People may like to tell themselves that art is actually beyond the grubby world of commerce and money. They've never actually been to an art auction or dealt with the art business, in fact. They may like to think that art is not a consumption good, but in fact, that's exactly what it is. Art works, paintings, sculptures, books, music, all of these things are things that are produced by producers to be sold to consumers. It's a consumption good, just like any other kind of consumption good. Food, clothes, housing, anything of that sort. Now, of course, you can, if you want, make a product that only you like. It may be that you have a particular taste or idea that you are really keen on, and that when it comes to be done, when push comes to shove, the product that you bring out, the music that you make or the art that you paint is not something that many people like. Maybe you think it's great, but nobody else does. That's fine. You're perfectly at liberty to do this. But you won't get paid. That's the simple cost of this. Now, alternatively, you might think, if you're an artist of this kind, that you should be supported by the taxpayer through state subsidies, for example. But this is nonsense, actually. If you produce something and people aren't voluntarily prepared to pay for it or support you that way, why should they then support you involuntarily by having income taken away from them in tax to be given to you? What makes you so special that you can demand to be supported in this way? So art, in fact, is simply a product which should be, and in fact historically normally is, produced and traded within a market like any other. The real question you need to ask if you are an artist trying to make a living out of being an artist is, who are your customers or clients? Because that will tend to shape what you can do, what kind of art you will produce, or at least what kind of art you could produce and be paid for. You may still do your own stuff on the side in the knowledge that you're not going to be paid for doing it. Now, the answer to that question of who the customers or clients of the artist are has changed significantly over time. And in particular, it has changed significantly with the growth of market economies. Now, here is the model that you find in the medieval and Renaissance era. Now, this applies to Europe. It also applies to the Middle East, for example, the Ottoman Empire. It's different in China. Interestingly, China, from a very early date, has a much more commercial kind of approach to art, which is similar to the one that develops much later in Europe. So the key feature of medieval and Renaissance Europe and other parts of the world is that there is no mass market for art or music. There are indeed things like popular music, popular art indeed, but these don't bring in much in the way of a living. And very little of it has survived, so we don't actually know that much about it. So there's no genuine mass market or even significantly large size market for art or music. So what this means is that if you're an artist a painter or a musician or an architect, you're dependent on either institutions or wealthy individuals. The institutions, it basically means monarchs and the church, particularly before the Reformation. The wealthy individuals are aristocrats, kings in their capacity as individuals, or sometimes wealthy merchants, wealthy bourgeois. Now, it's worth saying that artists are a bit like football clubs and players today. They are status symbols for wealthy people. So wealthy people will pay for works of art, pay for and support and be the patron of an artist as a way of showing off their social status. This is the kind of market that we have here. Now, here is a man who is one of our best sources for the way in which that market for art in the medieval and Renaissance period worked. This is a man called Vasari. He was an artist himself, quite a distinguished painter and architect, who lived in Florence in the 16th century. But he's best known now not for the artistic work he produced, but for an enormous encyclopedic kind of book of biographies, usually known as the Lives of the Artists, which he published in the middle of the 16th century. And Vasari's Lives of the Artists has been in print ever since. Well worth reading. I strongly recommend it. Now, in this, Vasari gives a very interestingly hard-headed and, from what we can tell, completely accurate portrayal of how art was actually produced and the economics of art at the time. He explicitly emphasizes the role of competition, or concorrenza, as he calls it, using the Italian word, amongst artists. And he uses the word competition in exactly the way that a modern economist would use it. His argument is that artists are constantly competing with each other to get commissions from wealthy patrons, popes, princes, condottieri, wealthy bourgeois, and the like. And he thinks that it's this competition between the artist that explains the improvement in technique and the other innovations that took place during the Renaissance. He also uses it to explain why, in his unbiased opinion, the Florentines are better than anybody else at producing great art. He thinks that this is because the Florentines are more competitive. They're in a more competitive world. They have to compete that little bit more than, say, Venetian artists, who are supported by the Doge and the Venetian Senate. And so as a result, he explicitly argues, they have to come up with new ways of doing things, new styles to attract the attention of patrons like the popes or the Medici or the other wealthy noblemen and merchants of northern Italy. There's also a competitive market between patrons. Patrons are competing, as I said, for social status. And it's very entertaining to read how patrons complain about what they see as the wastefulness of their star artists. There's also lots of amusing anecdotes of the preciousness of artists and their self-absorption. Very entertaining. It does make the world of Renaissance art in Italy sound extremely like contemporary Hollywood. And it has to be said that Vasari is extremely bitchy in his portrayal and remarks of some of his contemporaries. Now, up in the north of Europe, however, a shift takes place. In the early 17th century, you get the appearance for the first time of truly commercial art. This takes place in the Dutch Republic during what we call the Golden Age, the period from roughly 1600 through to 1670. What you get here is a much wider customer base than you'd had in Renaissance Italy or other parts of Renaissance Europe. It was much, much more bourgeois. The Dutch Republic, as a mercantile state, had a much larger and more wealthy middle class than most other European societies at the time. And so the typical client or customer for an artist is no longer an extremely wealthy bourgeois, much less a prince or a pope. It's a much more middle class kind of bourgeois, comfortable and well off, but not part of the top 1%. And this is reflected in the subject matter of art. Dutch art becomes much more concerned with the domestic and with trade, and much less concerned with war, religion, and the chase, hunting, which are the typical interests of aristocrats that you find reflected in art elsewhere. And also, artists become more self-employed and they gain greater control of their work. Instead of having a patron who is competing for the attention of patrons, artists become essentially self-employed business people who compete with each other to sell their wares to a much larger and more open market. And this is the way in which markets work. As the market becomes wider, as the pool of consumers become greater, the independence of the artist actually necessarily increases because they have a wider market to sell into. If you're competing for the attention of one of maybe 100 patrons, things are quite difficult for you. If you are competing, on the other hand, to sell portraits and paintings to several thousand or even tens of thousands of people, you're talking about a quite different kind of market system, one that gives you much more scope both for independence and for variety of output. Now, here's an example of what I was talking about. This is, of course, Rembrandt van Rijn, or Rembrandt, as we just call him these days. One of the greatest artists of not just the Dutch Golden Age, but of all time. This is one of his self-portraits, but also very much a businessman. Rembrandt had a large studio, which is almost like a factory, producing works for commission or to sell out into the market of the Dutch Golden Age. And very often he would do the initial sketching and the initial touching, but then would leave his journeymen to actually do most of the work, and he would finally touch it up and correct it slightly at the end. It was almost like a factory producing works. This is one reason why there are so many Rembrandts out there in circulation, because of the move towards not quite full mass production, but something approaching it that we see at this time. On the other hand, this is the work of an artist who produced a relatively small number of outputs. This is a Vermeer painting. You will immediately recognize it if you know anything about Vermeer, because almost all of his paintings show the same basic backdrop and setting, which is a room in his house in Delft. So Vermeer is still working in the business of producing a relatively small number of works, which he sold for a high price, but he still doesn't depend upon an individual patron. Notice also the domesticity of the work here. It's very much a domestic scene. It's often called a music lesson. You can see a music lesson going on here. The young lady here is sitting at a keyboard instrument, a spinet probably, and there in the foreground before her you can see a large stringed instrument, a bowed instrument, and you can see also the table with a jug and other things on it, which occurs in many of Vermeer's other paintings. So this again reflects the interests of the market audience in the Dutch Republic. The paintings are being bought by bourgeois who are interested in portrayals of the domestic and commercial life of the Dutch Republic, rather than the hunt, the chase, and warfare, which are the things that tend to turn on and interest aristocrats elsewhere in Europe. Notice also, I have to say this, the quite brilliant way in which Vermeer has captured the reflection of the young woman's face and of the floor in the mirror, in the light falling onto the mirror from outside. It's one of the things that makes him one of the greatest painters of all time. So what is the impact of industrial capitalism upon all this? Well, what commercial capitalism does is to create a true mass market for art, where it's not even the middle class, but society in general that are increasingly the consumers of art. Now, this does not just happen in Europe. It also happens on an enormous scale, for example, in Edo-era Japan. Japan under the later Tokugawa, between roughly the middle of the 18th century and the middle of the 19th century. This is when you get the production of all those famous Japanese woodcuts, ukiyo-e as they're called, things like the Great Wave at Kanagawa, the work of Hiroshige, which has been reproduced 1,000 times in posters. You also got the same thing in Qing, China, where you get the production of mass consumption art. There'd always been a kind of more commercial art market in China, but it becomes even more widespread during the later 18th century. So commercial capitalism is doing this trick in Japan as much as it is in Europe. Now, it happens right across the spectrum of forms of artistic production. So you get it in literature, where from the mid-18th century onwards, you have the bestseller novel. You have novels produced on a large scale for sale to a mass audience. This becomes even more pronounced from the 1850s onwards, where the advent of the linotype printing press makes possible things like so-called yellowbacks, cheap mass-produced paperback books or cheap bound books, which are produced for sale to a working class audience, not just a middle class one. You also get music with the advent of commercial music made for consumption in the home, performance in the home, but also mass production of sheet music for sale to concerts everywhere. So someone like Giuseppe Verdi, for example, is a great commercial artist. He's a mass bestseller, if you will, at the time. The same is also true in the decorative and illustrative arts and design, in things like porcelain, wallpaper, house furnishings, house design, and the like. There's also, because of capitalism and the innovation it brings, a whole range of new art forms which become possible towards the end of the 19th and the start of the 20th century. One, for example, is photography, which then leads on into film and television, which appear for the first time in the very end of the 19th century and the start of the 20th century. You also get, of course, radio from the 1900s onwards. Now, at the same time, of course, older forms continue. Painting is still going on. You still have monumental art in the form of sculpture and the like, increasingly funded either by taxation, of course, or by public subscription. So what you have is a different kind of market. There are far more customers, a whole several orders of magnitude more customers than there were even in the Dutch Republic. You've gone from thousands to millions of customers, or even with a global bestseller, tens of millions. You can make a lot of money out of this, far more money than someone like Rembrandt could make, much less even a Renaissance artist like Raphael. So people like Dickens and Balzac are amongst the best paid people of their time. They are basically the Robert Ludlum or I don't know, Sidney Sheldon of their day, essentially. Dickens is mass producing novels, churning out novels in part format for a mass audience. Similarly, Balzac, similarly, many of the other great writers of the era, people like George Eliot, Emile Zola, the list can go on and on. There's a much wider variety and range of taste and products. What you find is that because this is a mass market, you now actually have a much wider range of tastes. You no longer have tastes set by a very limited number of patrons or a relatively distinct class of wealthy middle class or bourgeois. Rather, you have a mass audience which is much more diverse, much more varied in what it's interested in and what it's prepared to pay for. And the point, of course, is that even a small number of a very large market can support somebody with a reasonable income. So you get the phenomenon of what is known as the long tail, where because the overall market is so large, quite niche or esoteric or peculiar forms of art can now become commercially viable. And what you find as a result of this is a huge range of eclecticism and completely new styles of art appearing. Now, when I say eclecticism, one of the main forms that this takes is the revival of older forms of art, such as Gothic architecture or Renaissance architecture or classical architecture, but also the adoption and importation of art forms and art styles from outside Europe and North America. So you have, for example, Japanese from the 1870s onwards, the systematic imitation of the art forms of Japan, of Edo era Japan, in fact. You also get the development of completely new or novel styles of art. Art Nouveau, which appears after roughly 1870, is the first example of this. Later on, you get Art Deco, and then a whole range of new artistic movements in the course of the 20th century, from Dada, Surrealism onwards. You also get, of course, Impressionism, Post-Impressionism, and all these other things. So here we have an example. This is an example of the Japanese I mentioned. This is the so-called Peacock Room, designed for a wealthy Liverpudlian shipping magnate by the American artist Whistler. There's a very saucy story associated with this, which I'm not going to tell you, but which I suggest you find out about. The room is now to be found in the Sackler Gallery in Washington, D.C. But this is an example of the kind of eclecticism and borrowing that you find in the 19th century commercial art world. Very much a commercial world, by the way. Whistler charged an absolute fortune for this work. Here's an example of the new tendencies in art. This is an Art Nouveau decoration of the very distinctive style that appears in the Belle Epoque at the end of the 19th century, but the first of many quite new kinds of art form that were to appear. Now, there's a reaction against this. That quote from Oscar Wilde that I gave you earlier expressed a reaction that became quite common amongst artists at the end of the 19th century during the so-called fin de siècle, a reaction against the hand that was feeding them, if you will, given that Wilde was a very successful, commercially successful playwright and artist and author. Now, what I think it reflected was snobbery on the part of artists, and a distaste that they felt for the middle classes and their tastes, which they saw as plebeian and philistine. There was also at the same time the growth of a kind of subworld or demi-monde, the bohemian culture of professional artists, musicians, actors, actresses and the like, which amongst other things showed hostility to business. They were very much engaged in business and living in a commercial world, but they resented the fact, and they felt that there was a kind of clash or hostility between their own sensibility and that of the commercial market that they were involved in. As I say, I think myself that this is self-indulgence and also snobbery. You may have a more elevated view of it, but the phenomenon is undoubtedly something that happened. But at the same time also, artists were finding themselves increasingly of interest to the rulers, because the rulers, the politicians, governments, wanted to get control of art and use it for their own purposes, as indeed they always had done. So in the 20th century, you do have one story, and this is growing state support of the arts, but this usually meant also state control of the arts, as the person who pays the piper is going to call for the tune. And in this case, it's the taxpayer, or more explicitly, the political class. And what you get is the deliberate use of art as propaganda. Now, this is not new. Kings and popes have been doing this for centuries, but the scale is new. And you find this both in despotisms like Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, things like socialist realism in the Soviet Union, for example, but also in democracy. In the US under the New Deal, in the UK with things like the Festival of Britain, and subsequently, you find democratic governments also using art as a means of expressing support for a particular set of values. They are associated with explicitly anti-market ideologies. And this is true whether it's social democracy in the democratic case, communism in the case of the Soviet Union, or the kind of martial anti-market ideology of the fascist states in Nazi Germany or fascist Italy. But it's worth saying that this kind of movement is also very often supported by the wealthy, people like Charles Saatchi, for example. And as it had been during the Renaissance, it's a way for the wealthy to distinguish themselves from the common mass and the common herd by supporting art that the lay public finds either repulsive or strange. Not mentioning any names here, people with considerable wealth can show that they have a different and supposedly superior taste to the common man and woman. So it's a way of asserting distinctiveness. Now, what is the actual other story that you can tell about art and capitalism in the 20th century? Most of the art that is actually produced today is commercial and private. This is very much true for music, but it's also true for things like domestic design, commercial art, posters, book covers, commercial art of all kinds, in other words, and in fact, the entire range of artistic production. All the best quality art, the art that I would predict is going to survive and be written about by the art historians in 100 years' time, or by some contemporary Giorgio Vasari, is of this kind, not of the kind, generally, that has been produced or supported by public support. There are some exceptions to that, obviously, but not much. You can also see a continuing process driven by the market of cultural interpenetration and innovation, constant borrowing in all of the different forms and genres of art from different cultures, different parts of the world, constant innovation by artists to find new forms, new ways of doing things, and very often new ways of combining and interpreting old things, which is what artists have been doing since the year dot. The mass market that they are selling to both encourages them to do this because it makes you distinctive and different, and it also makes it easier and more possible to do this because it means that you will have a secure income for doing it. So in fact, the history of market economies and capitalism and art is one in which the growth of the market has actually made artists better off, increase the range and sources of income that they can get, as well as the quantity of income that they can get, and has made possible a much greater diversity and range of artistic forms of expression and of artistic innovation.